Christmas, the pagan festival of solstice, first co-opted by Christianity, then by Charles Dickens, and when he was no longer cool, it was co-opted by the only religion that guarantees instant gratification, rampant consumerism. A time of enforced happiness, when you're made to feel like your life has just been a decades-long Sam Alvey losing streak, if your Christmas day doesn't look like a mashup of It's a Wonderful Life and MTV's Cribs.
Right here, this is like my movie collection and CD collection too. You know, Stripes and Bad Boys and Wild Things. I still got an X-rated one here too, though. Gotta keep it real.
Families gather for dinner and quickly ungather as someone invariably gets drunk and makes things deeply uncomfortable for everyone. It's also the time of year when every YouTuber must write some kind of end-of-year piece, as is mandated in the blood contract we sign with YouTube's demonic overlords. Biscuit, is this contract even legal?
Just sign a fucking contract, Napoleon. Yum, yum, human souls.
But before we proceed, a tribute to those we lost in 2022. January. Named after Janus, the Roman god of beginnings and transitions, heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou took the transition part a bit too seriously during his fight with Cyril Gane at UFC 270. Francis, a man famous for knockouts more brutal than the audience reviews for a straight-to-DVD Steven Seagal movie, transitioned from Francis the Fist delivery system to a brand new mythical fighter, Division 1 wrestler Ngannou. This was shocking to fans, as the majority of us have eyes and witnessed him getting humped like a poodle's pillow when he fought Stipe Miocic. Francis was to wrestling what CM Punk was to striking. Not so at UFC 270, where Francis Ngannou used his D1 wrestling credentials to wrestle hump Gane and retain his title. But D1 Francis wasn't the only shock that night. Post-fight, Dana White wasn't there to put the belt around Francis' waist.
For anybody to think that I was showing any type of disrespect toward Francis, I saw Francis all week, you idiots. I shook his hand. I said hi to him. I was out there for the stare downs, the whole thing.
It would later emerge that contract negotiations between Francis and the UFC had ended acrimoniously, thanks to Francis having the balls to demand the UFC pay him more than venom coupons and a half-eaten packet of corn nuts. Corn to the core. Ngannou's dispute is still ongoing, and he hasn't fought since UFC 270. January also saw the retirement of Jeremy Stephens. Stephens' most noteworthy moment in the UFC was the time Conor McGregor cast Igni on his ass with what even I can agree was probably the most intense burn I've ever heard at a UFC press conference.
This guy TKOs people. When I knock people out, they don't fucking move. Who the fuck is that guy? Who the fuck is that?
The beef between Dana White and Jake Paul went from sizzling to overcooked when Jake released this absolute fucking banger.
Dana, yeah, fuck Dana White, yeah, Dana, fuck Dana White, yeah, Dana, fuck Dana White.
Cool.
February 2022. And John Jones' legal troubles are going from strength to strength. After being arrested in September of 2021 for assaulting his fiancée, police body cam footage emerges showing disturbing behaviour from Jones as he headbutts a police car, possibly because he mistook it for his fiancée.
Officers, I hate you. I hate you.
Joe Rogan had a brush with cancellation after a compilation of him saying the N-word on his show went viral. People demanded that Rogan, a man with $100 million podcast, but 5 out of 10 at best stand-up specials, be cancelled faster than a Paramount Plus subscription. Joe apologised profusely, and you can tell he genuinely meant it, as for his apology video, he put on a turtleneck and sat in front of a bookshelf, like an anthropology professor with a crippling human growth hormone addiction. Real-life internet meme Dale Brown had his first fight in the UFC when he cornered actual fighter Joaquin Buckley. To be fair to Dale, the only reason we haven't seen him in the UFC yet is because he can't actually fight. But joking aside, his dust self-defense system really does work, as it guarantees you will get shot, stabbed or strangled to death. And once dead, you don't have to worry about ever being attacked again. UFC 272 was headlined by a grudge match years in the making when Jorge Masvidal faced off against Colby Covington. Masvidal and Covington had been bosom chums when they trained together at ATT, but in an effort to distract people from how boring his career was, Colby elevated his shit-talking to Dante Must Die difficulty, for which he was eventually kicked out of ATT and alienated himself from former bestie Masvidal.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
At UFC 272, Masvidal was thoroughly outclassed over the course of 5 rounds, but Masvidal honed his craft fighting in the backyards with Kimbo Slice. To quote Conor McGregor,
This is not over. If we have to take this outside with him, it's all outside.
After studying Ishida Kim's secrets of ninja invisibility, he snuck up behind Colby outside a restaurant and treated him to an all-you-can-eat buffet of smacks to the face. Masvidal landed more significant strikes outside of a Buffalo Wild Wings than he did in the octagon. His criminal case is still ongoing. At UFC London, future superstar Paddy Pimblett and some guy called Ilia Topuria were involved in an altercation in a hotel lobby. Pimblett, who was minding his own business just hanging out being cool as fuck, was accosted by Topuria and roughly 47 of his friends. Pimblett remained cool under intense pressure and flung a bottle of hand sanitizer at Topuria's head with deadly accuracy. Pimblett avoided jail time by pleading guilty to assault with a cleanly weapon and ordered to remain 50 feet from cleaning products at all times. Ilia Topuria was let off with a warning under the condition he stopped being such a little bitch. UFC London also saw a new record for most post-fight bonuses ever awarded. Every single finish on the card was awarded a $50,000 bonus. The total amounted to $450,000, which sounds like a lot until you remember Dana White bets an average of $75,000 per hand at blackjack. Outside of UFC news, the most interesting thing to happen to Glory Kickboxing since they lost Alex Pereira took place at Glory 80, when the entire crowd put on a better fight than anything that was happening in the ring. April was a hard month for fans of Chan Sung Jung, aka the Korean Zombie. With spring in the air, it was the autumn for Zombie's career. He fought Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 273, and the man once famous for being knocked down but getting up again more times than a Chumbawamba Greatest Hits album took a beating so one-sided it was like someone had disconnected his controller. TJ Dillashaw was back in the UFC news when he called out bantamweight champion Aljamain Sterling for not being champion caliber and called him a pretty easy fight for me, a statement that I'm sure absolutely won't come back to haunt him at any point in this video. Dean Barry detailed how he spent his entire life savings to get back into the UFC, and if he considered that a shrewd investment, then I've got some magic beans that may be of interest to him. Barry fought the man who slew CM Punk, Mike Jackson, at UFC Vegas 52. Barry's UFC career would prove to be short-lived after he was ousted from the roster for attempting to tickle Mike Jackson's brain through his eye socket.
So, shout out to his family.
I'll snatch every motherfucker birthday.
And to further add to the cursed nature of everyone involved in the CM Punk debacle, Mickey Gall would get sent on the lightless walk at UFC 273. With his contract expiring after the loss, it's now possible that Gall, Jackson and Punk have all been removed from the UFC roster, closing one of the most lamentable chapters in MMA since the one in Made in America with the pig testicles. Nate Diaz was shockingly the most sensible man in the room when it came to the UFC's expansion into the scum shit world of NFTs, when he advised everyone not to buy his NFT from what he called the sorry ass UFC. But tragically, on the 28th of April, Brendan Schaub was responsible for the worst drop since the Hiroshima bomb, when he unleashed his stand-up special, The Gringo Pappy, which took a terrible toll on the audience of a South Texas comedy club. Schaub is still at large, wanted for crimes against comedy. If spotted, do not approach Brenda, as he should be considered stupid and unfunny. May began promisingly with the news that Claudia Gadelha wanted to come out of retirement to face Joanna Jędrzejczyk.
Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Joanna Jędrzejczyk.
In a grappling match. She didn't specify if it would be taking place on her OnlyFans, but here's hoping. Inventor of jiu-jitsu and father of lies, Rickson Gracie claimed it's hard for people to deny his 450-0 fight record. Unfortunately for Rickson, his Charlie Z fantasy is actually very easy to deny because it's complete bollocks. CM Punk returned to the world of pro wrestling when he joined AEW, where he received a hero's welcome. I haven't looked into it lately, but I'm sure everything's still going great for him over there. The hilarious news that Nate Diaz had been asking the UFC to let him fight Khamzat Chimaev surfaced.
That's the most retarded shit I ever heard, mentally.
Chimaev had been mangling opponents like Brendan Schaub on a punchline, so the prospect of an old and shop-worn Nate Diaz fighting the most terrifying prospect in the UFC was so wild, even Khamzat had a good laugh about it. Because that's crazy, right? The UFC would never schedule a fight that ludicrous, right? In other Nate Diaz news, Nate was spotted relieving himself outside the UFC Performance Institute. In Nate's defense, he claimed he had to go really bad. UFC 274 continued their heartbreaking run of seeing more legends get executed than a God of War game when Tony Ferguson fought Michael Chandler. Tony was put on airplane mode by a front kick to the face so brutal, Steven Seagal retroactively claimed to have taught Chandler how to do it. 274 also played host to a fight that would go down in infamy as the single worst title fight of all time, Rose Namajunas vs Carla Esparza 2. Over the course of 5 excruciating rounds, both participants landed less strikes than a blind bowler, and the only people at risk of losing consciousness were the audience. But the insanity of 274 wasn't over, as lightweight champion Charles Oliveira weighed in a half a pound over the limit for his title fight with Justin Gaethje. As punishment, Oliveira was stripped of the title, and even though he would go on to beat Gaethje in the main event, the belt remained vacant, making the entire main event the most pointless conflict since the Falklands. Summer kicked off with a depressing thud when it emerged that not only was Antonio Bigfoot Silva still fighting, he was still losing, and in the worst way possible. Bigfoot hadn't had a win since 2013 and has lost almost all his fights since then by devastating knockout. It's another depressing example of a man who's being let down by his trainers and managers and anyone who enables him to continue fighting. At this stage, Bigfoot's fighting career is shaving years off his life with every devastating loss, and ensuring his quality of life for his later years is going to be truly abysmal. While it may be depressing to see Bigfoot eat loss after loss, the one losing streak we can all get behind kept on streaking as jacked white boy Husamer Paul Harris suffered his 3rd straight KO loss. In non-UFC news, Tenshin Nasukawa fought Takeru Sagawa in a fight creatively dubbed The Match 2022. I know to some Western fight fans who may only follow the UFC, the roster of promotions like Rizin or ONE FC can sometimes look like the biggest assortment of nondescript Asian fighters outside of a Yakuza game, and The Match 2022 looks like a fight between the two least charismatic members of a K-pop boy band. But if you haven't seen The Match 2022 and still call yourself a fight fan, then you, my friend, are a fucking fraud. June also saw high-profile retirements as Zabit Magomed Sharipov, one of the only Dagestani fighters to put all his experience points into striking instead of wrestling, and one of the most exciting strikers in the UFC, retired at age 31 on a perfect 6-0 streak in the UFC. But while Zabit retired just as his career was getting started, Joanna Yi Owl Jade Shaq announced her retirement after a UFC career that saw her go on an 8-fight win streak, win the strawweight belt, defend it 5 times, and cement her position as the Queen of Violence. At UFC 275, Yuri Prohaska made Glover Teixeira tap for the first time in his 20-year career, and some people argued that Talia Santos actually beat Valentina Shevchenko, but those people can get fucked. UFC 277 was headlined by Amanda Nunes vs Juliana Pena 2. Pena had beaten Nunes and won the belt the previous December, but accusations of a fluke win dogged all 7 and a bit months of her title reign. UFC 277 was her chance to prove to the world her win was no fluke and earn her first successful title defense. But it turns out maybe it was kind of a fluke. Retired fighter Felice Herrig revealed that her OnlyFans account had made her more money than her UFC career. And while people who bled for the promotion were propping up their retirement fund by selling feet pictures and farts in a jar, Dana White was spunking money all over YouTubers. For reasons unknown, Dana gave one of the Nelk boys $250,000 as a birthday gift. And if anyone can explain to me why the bald father seems to have an erection more tumescent than his own head for whatever the fucking Nelk boy is, I'm all ears. 1 month on from his last loss, Bigfoot Silva was back fighting. I know what you're thinking, and yes, you are correct. The mandatory layoff after a knockout loss is 90 days according to most athletic commissions. But this is Russia, and while they may not have invented the freak show fight, they're doing their best to perfect it. And should you ever find yourself like Bigfoot Silva, fighting in a Russian boxing promotion shadier than an oak tree in high summer, and your opponent is a convicted felon and active white supremacist, athletic commissions are probably the least of your concerns. At the press conference for UFC 277, Israel Adesanya torpedoed his own reputation as an elite trash talker. While trading barbs with Alex Pereira, Izzy dropped an insult sicker than Typhoid Mary.
And this time when I put you on skates, I'm gonna leave you frozen like Elsa.
8-year-old kids everywhere lost their fucking minds, while the rest of us were left wondering if this was some paid promotion he was doing on the part of Disney, while half expecting him to follow up by threatening to fold Pereira like a Ridge wallet. And the award for worst trash talk of the year goes to Israel Adesanya. Thank you, Izzy. Your Disney-based insult was leader of the pack when it came to bottom of the barrel trash talk this year. As such, you have been awarded the inaugural blown apart Tito Ortiz Award for worst trash talk. Take a bow. August saw more retirements than Musk-era Twitter. One of the best to ever do it, Jose Aldo, called it a career after holding belts in the WEC and UFC and going on an unprecedented 18-fight win streak across both organizations, 7 of which were back-to-back title defenses. Jose finally hung up his gloves. As the single most successful featherweight of all time and one of the most lauded fighters the UFC has ever seen, Jose will be remembered mostly for that one time McGregor knocked him out in 13 seconds. Professional dickhead Luke Rockhold also called time on his career. A veteran of Strikeforce and former UFC middleweight champion, Luke's chiseled good looks were perhaps a detriment to his fighting career, as he became more famous as a pretty boy Ralph Lauren model than as a fighter. But nothing about Luke's retirement fight was pretty, as he called upon the spirits of his Just Bleed ancestors for one of the most memorable fights of 2022 and one of the most memorable MMA moments of all time. In one single act, Luke rewrote the narrative of his entire career, erasing the image of the fashion model turned fighter. As the fight drew to a close, Rockhold, bleeding heavily from his mouth and nose, smeared that blood all over Paulo Costa's face in a moment of unbridled barbarism.
Hey, I see some battle wounds and some bruises. That's great.
And for that, Rockhold wins the inaugural Blown Apart Just Bleed Award for 2022's most Just Bleed moment of the year. Take a fucking bow, Luke. Fellow Just Bleed enthusiast Rory MacDonald, one half of the most violent fight of all time, also called it a career. MacDonald, a man who once seemed like it would take a direct hit from the hammer of dawn to stop him, knew it was time to retire after he suffered a first round KO loss to a relatively unknown fighter in a relatively unknown organisation. Uriah Hall, a fighter who delivered more spinning shit than a coprophiliac's washing machine, left the UFC, one of the single most frustrating fighters of all time, thanks to his talent for brutal knockouts but complete inability to reliably pull them off. Hall immediately jumped on the YouTube boxing bandwagon, where he beat Levon Bell, who was some YouTuber or kindergarten teacher or pizza delivery man. Realistically, who gives a fuck? In Hollywood news, professional Twitter user Conor McGregor announced he was going to do to the world of acting what he did to the world of old men quietly enjoying a drink. This man...
All this chicken and king talk swirling around out there. It's got me really fired up.
This man...
I don't care what country, what city, what kingdom you are in, I'll find you and make you kiss my feet.
This fucking man...
Spicy and crispy and juicy. It just doesn't stand a chance.
Announced his move into the world of acting. McGregor, whose best acting role to date was the time he played a 100% mute character in Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, would join the cast of a Roadhouse reboot alongside Jake Gyllenhaal, who must be missing car payments or something. In another example of time being a flat circle, Ronda Rousey was also tipped to star in a remake of Roadhouse back in 2015. It was cancelled, and now she's phoning in voice lines for Mortal Kombat games.
Get out of Earthrealm, Shao Kahn.
Oh, what, woman?
How about I show you?
So I look forward to seeing McGregor doing his best Johnny Cage in Mortal Kombat 14.
I'll find you and make you kiss my feet.
Fuck that guy.
Lenin once said, "There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen." And in the week-long run-up to UFC 279, days passed like decades. From its inception, 279 was a deeply weird card, flying in the face of all established logic. The main event was Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz. Anybody with even a passing knowledge of MMA knows this was a horrible matchup. A surging contender famous for more wrestle-fucking than Hulk Hogan's sex tape versus a man who was famously weak against wrestlers and made his MMA debut before the release of the Xbox 360. Conspiracy theories were rife, and for once, they actually sounded pretty plausible. With this being Nate's final fight on his contract, was all this a Dana-orchestrated plot to tank Nate's stock before he left the UFC? As fans gathered for the pre-fight press conference, something unprecedented in UFC history happened. Dana took to the stage to tell everyone the press conference had been cancelled.
Yeah, this ain't gonna happen. I apologize, everybody. I am in very weird waters here. This has never happened in the history of this company. So, trust me when I tell you this is the right decision not to do this press conference right now. And yeah, I hear you. I'm with you. But for everybody's safety, this is the right decision.
Unbeknownst to the audience, Chimaev and Kevin Holland's teams had gotten into a brawl. Not to be outdone, the Diaz crew joined in the fun with their signature move of throwing bottles. Dana, who it's worth noting still held a press conference after McGregor flew a plane full of proper 12 swilling thugs halfway around the world to assault a bus, felt the situation was too dangerous and scrapped the entire press conference. The following morning at the 279 weigh-ins, Chimaev didn't so much miss weight as he actively avoided weight. He was 7.5 pounds over the middleweight limit, which is almost completely unheard of for a main event in the UFC, and would probably raise eyebrows if it happened in fucking street beefs. Despite missing weight by 7.5 pounds or one full-sized Henry Cejudo, Khamzat seemed like he gave less fucks than a lazy prostitute. Rather than apologise, he did a fairly impressive heel turn by flipping off the crowd and then laid down some blistering trash talk about wanting to fuck a boy backstage or something.
Hey, this is Chechen, motherfucker! Shut up, guys! I'll fuck your boy up! I fuck him backstage as well!
Truly terrifying. But Chimaev wasn't alone, as the entire card was plagued with weight misses. Chris Barnett somehow managed to miss the 260-pound limit for heavyweight. Macy Chiasson missed weight for her bout with Irene Aldana, and on the prelims, Hakeem Dawodu also missed weight. While Chiasson and Dawodu's fights were held at catchweights, Chimaev's massive miss meant the main event was completely rebooked. Instead of Diaz versus Chimaev, we now got Diaz versus Tony Ferguson, which was the fight fans had wanted ever since hearing Ferguson and Diaz would be on the same card. Instead of seeing a fan favourite like Diaz get taken out behind the woodshed by Chimaev, we now had a fight between two legends at the tail end of their careers. Due to the backstage beef between Holland and Chimaev, they would now face off in the co-main, while Li Jingliang,
that evil Chinese man Ling Jingling and Jingling,
originally scheduled to fight Tony Ferguson, was now rebooked to fight Daniel Rodriguez. Chimaev's weight miss and subsequent shuffling of the bouts had actually improved the card for everyone, aside from maybe Li Jingliang and his baller-ass suit. Ultimately, Diaz would defeat Ferguson via guillotine, a bittersweet victory for several reasons, chiefly as it was the last time we'll ever see Diaz in the UFC before he gets an I Love Jake Paul tattoo in order to secure a boxing match with him, and despite Ferguson putting on a solid performance, it could potentially be the last time we see him too, as the loss put him on a 5-fight losing streak. Chimaev versus Holland was the only fight I've ever seen where the loser would have performed the exact same had he not even turned up. Holland landed literally nothing. No strikes, no takedown attempts, no sweeps, nothing. Khamzat won via complete and utter shutout. And to fully cement his heel turn, in his post-fight speech, Khamzat screamed "Allahu Akbar, gonna kill everyone" in an event held in America on September 11th. To add to the overall weird vibes, after Johnny Walker won his fight, he was escorted out of the arena without even being allowed to change. The UFC basically made him do the walk of shame, kicking him out while still in his shorts, and left him to roam the Vegas Strip like he was cosplaying as a fighter to pose for photos with tourists. And Irene Aldana won her fight with one of the single most bizarre finishes of all time, when she TKO'd Macy Chiasson with the first ever up heel kick liver shot in UFC history.
お前に三島を継ぐ権利はない。話にならんわ。生まれ変わって出直してこい。お前に三島を継ぐ権利はない。
Thank you, UFC 278. The sheer insanity of your fight week has given us the most elevated GoofCon threat level since the McGregor bus attack. As such, you are the winner of the inaugural Blown Apart GoofCon 4 award for Goofiest Moment of the Year. Take a bow. Dana White announced the formation of a brand new combat sports league, with promotions like ONE FC offering up MMA, Muay Thai, kickboxing and grappling all under the same banner. The time was right for Dana to shake up the world of combat sports. Dana's very own new Coke moment arrived with the announcement that his brave new venture would be Power Slap League, an announcement that was decidedly less 1FC and more Fight Circus. But Dana refuses to wake up from this fever dream, and Power Slap League, the sport that answers the question, what if you could turn pro at spousal abuse, will be launching in 2023. At UFC 280, TJ Dillashaw slithered out of suspension and made his UFC return after spending years in the wilderness due to a doping scandal. Dillashaw got an immediate title shot against bantamweight champion Aljamain Sterling, the man Dillashaw had branded as not being champion caliber just a few months earlier. While Sterling may not be champion caliber, what he did have was 2 working arms. Unknown by spectators, athletic commissions and the UFC themselves, Dillashaw went into the fight with a shoulder that he would later claim had popped out more times than Harvey Weinstein's cock. The end result was that Dillashaw was rendered a one-armed man in a face-punching contest. Not champion caliber Sterling mauled TJ on his way to one of the easiest title defenses of the year. In the main event of 280, Charles Oliveira, imaginary lightweight champion of the world, fought Islam Makhachev for the actual real lightweight title. Makhachev ran through Oliveira like an out-of-date curry and immediately took his belt for a visit to the house of a brutal overseer of massive and systematic oppression, where it now hangs right next to the Kadyrov World Championship belt for most gays tortured or murdered. Jake Paul took a step up in competition, or at the very least a step sideways in competition, when he boxed a 47-year-old MMA fighter, Anderson Silva. Silva had been on somewhat of a career resurgence himself. After leaving the world of MMA for boxing, he had wins over Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. and Tito Ortiz, though beating Tito Ortiz in boxing nowadays is probably about as difficult as beating him at Scrabble. Either way, Jake beat Anderson on points, and people argued, was it finally time to give Paul respect? After all, he had just beaten one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time in a sport that wasn't MMA. But I would posit the idea that I'll give Jake Paul respect as a boxer when he fights an actual professional boxer who was on a win streak, isn't old enough to be his father, and wasn't pulled out of Dennis Seaver's fun-time gym for bum-ass bums. The Taj Mahal is often considered the world's greatest monument to love, a 42-acre complex built to honour the memory of Mumtaz Mahal, the favourite wife of Shah Jahan, now considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. But that's bullshit, because we all know the greatest act of love ever committed to record was the time Conor McGregor chartered a private plane full of allegedly coked up violent scumbags and flew them across the Atlantic to defend the honour of his favourite wife, Artem Lobov. For a time, it seemed like McLobov was the power couple in MMA, a relationship stronger than the foundations of the earth, more beautiful than the alabaster skin of Aphrodite herself. McGregor had stepped all over the hopes and dreams of an entire cast of tough just to get his beloved a shot on the show. And when Lobov was harassed by Khabib, McGregor, dolly in hand, sprung to his defence. Truly, this love story was MMA's very own Twilight Saga. But in November 2022, it was winter without and winter within for McLobov, as news broke that there was trouble in paradise. A relationship that once seemed as unassailable as a fortress of granite. Lobov was now suing McGregor for a percentage of the profits from Proper 12 after claiming the idea had been all his. The spat came to a head when a heartbroken McGregor left a voice message for Lobov, challenging him to a fight at 10:30 PM that night behind the bike sheds at school.
This is a call out to Artem the Fanny, Fairly Pad, Lobov. I'm challenging you to a fight tonight, 10:30 PM. I'll meet you down at SPG Concord and we'll fight for the whole lot. Going through having lawyers message me about defamation and all this suing and all. You're a little blouse, mate. I'll see you at SPG Concord tonight, 10:30 PM, and I'll fight you for the whole lot, yeah? Answer this call out, yeah? You little blouse.
The tone of pleading desperation in the way Conor says, answer this call out, like an IRL, please respond, is difficult to miss. And that, my friends, was 2022.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, cause now I will snatch every motherfucking birthday.
Girl, what you really want all night? We want the punani, see for me feels nice. When the girls start to strut, you could look at their butt, you shouldn't do that. The gold dress is just a pity, not just there to cover her kitty.